In the winter of 1991, a young Australian man disappeared into the Himalayas. He wasn't an experienced mountaineer, nor was he attempting some record-breaking expedition. In fact, he had simply set out on what was supposed to be a short trek through the mountains of Nepal. But when he failed to return, people quickly assumed the worst. In the Himalayas, getting lost in the middle of winter usually ends only one way. What nobody knew, however, was that the young man was still alive. High above the valleys of Nepal, trapped beneath a rocky ledge and surrounded by he was fighting for his life with no food, no fire, and no way to call for help. For the next 43 days, he would endure one of the longest and most terrifying survival ordeals in the history of the Himalayas. This is the horrifying story of James Scott. In 1991, 22-year-old James Scott appeared to have his entire future laid out before him. He was a medical student from Brisbane, Australia, earning excellent grades and preparing to begin the next chapter of his life. Friends and family described him as intelligent, calm, and incredibly determined. James was also exceptionally fit. He loved hiking, cycled regularly, and trained constantly in karate, a sport that had become his greatest passion. Over the years, he had earned a black belt and even competed at the national level, winning championships and building a reputation for his discipline and resilience. It was that same determination that eventually brought him to Nepal. James had always wanted to spend part of his medical training helping people in developing countries. So, before graduating, he arranged an elective placement at a hospital in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. In September of 1991, he boarded a plane along with his close friend Tim Hooper and set off for what he believed would be one of the greatest adventures of his life. After arriving in Kathmandu, the two friends quickly settled in and began exploring the country. Like many visitors to Nepal, they soon became fascinated by the Himalayas. Towering snow-covered peaks surrounded the region, and stories of incredible treks seemed to be everywhere. Before long, James and Tim decided to experience the mountains for themselves. Their first trek took them along the famous Jomsom Trail, one of Nepal's most popular hiking routes. The journey lasted several days and took them through forests, rocky valleys, and some of the most breathtaking scenery on Earth. To their surprise, the trek wasn't nearly as difficult as they had expected. Although the temperatures were cold and the elevations were high, they managed the journey comfortably. The experience gave them confidence. After successfully completing the Jomsom Trail, James and Tim immediately began planning another trek before James's medical placement was due to begin. This time they chose the Halambu region, a remote and beautiful area northeast of Kathmandu. There was just one problem. Their first trek had taken place in September. Their second would begin in late December, right in the middle of the Himalayan winter. The mountains they had experienced only a few months earlier would now be a completely different world, and unfortunately, neither of them fully realized that. When they packed for the journey, they did so lightly. James brought some clothes, a sleeping bag, a few books to read in the evenings, and only 2 chocolate bars for snacks. There was no emergency equipment, no proper winter survival gear, and no real plan for what they would do if something went wrong. It was a decision that would nearly cost him his life. On December 22nd, the pair met another Australian traveler named Mark Fulton. The 3 men got along immediately and decided to continue together. But only a short time later, Tim injured his leg. At first, he tried to push through the pain, but eventually it became obvious that he couldn't continue. He made the difficult decision to return to Kathmandu. James immediately offered to go back with him, but Tim insisted that he stay and finish the trek. The 2 friends agreed to meet again on Christmas Eve for dinner at their favorite restaurant. Neither of them knew it would be more than 6 weeks before they saw each other again. James and Mark continued toward a route called the Gosankun Trail. Along the way, they met several hikers who told them there was no snow ahead and that conditions were good. Everything seemed fine. Then they woke up the next morning. Overnight, the mountains had transformed. Fresh snow covered the ground and thick clouds hung over the peaks. Concerned, they asked the lodge owner about the weather. The man assured them that the storm would pass and that there would be no problem crossing the mountains. Trusting his advice, they continued. It was a terrible mistake. Only a few hours later, a powerful snowstorm slammed into the region. The temperature dropped sharply and visibility disappeared. Massive snowflakes poured from the sky and quickly buried the trail beneath several inches of fresh snow. Soon, James and Mark could barely see a few meters in front of them. At one point, they accidentally became separated by a creek and spent 15 minutes shouting for each other through the storm. When they finally reunited, James wanted to turn back. Mark wanted to continue. The two men disagreed, and eventually they made a decision that would change everything. They split up. Mark continued forward while James attempted to retrace his steps back toward the lodge. It was the last time they would ever see each other. At first, James tried following his own footprints through the snow, but the storm was falling so heavily that the tracks disappeared almost immediately. Within minutes, every landmark was gone. Every trail marker had vanished. James Scott was completely lost. Believing that a nearby stream would eventually lead to a village, he decided to follow it downhill. For hours, he trudged through the deep snow, hoping to find some sign of civilization. Instead, he reached the end of the valley. The cliffs surrounding it were far too steep to descend, and going back through the storm seemed equally impossible. James was trapped. Then he made an unbelievable decision. He would climb. Despite having almost no climbing experience and a genuine fear of heights, he began scaling the icy cliff face. At times, he was hanging by nothing more than his fingertips. One mistake would send him plunging hundreds of feet to his death, yet somehow, after nearly 2 hours of climbing, he reached the top. Exhausted and freezing, he discovered a small, rocky overhang and crawled underneath it. That tiny shelter would become his home for the next 43 days. The first nights were almost unbearable. James knew enough about medicine to understand the dangers of hypothermia. Each evening, he removed his wet clothing, dried himself as best he could, and changed into whatever dry clothes remained. Still, he shivered uncontrollably. His feet became numb, and he couldn't sleep. One night, he became convinced that he would not survive until morning. So he pulled out a notebook and began writing a farewell letter to his family. He apologized for the pain his death would cause them, then placed the notebook away and waited to die. Morning came, and somehow, he was still alive. Back in Australia, James's family had no idea he was missing until Tim contacted them. The news sent everyone into a panic. Search teams were immediately organized in Nepal. Helicopters were sent into the mountains. Experienced mountaineers joined the effort, but nobody could find him. Days turned into weeks, and high above the valleys, James's situation became even worse. He had no food whatsoever. His only source of water was melted snow. Eventually, the hunger became unbearable. He thought constantly about food. He dreamed about food. Then, after nearly 2 weeks of starvation, something strange happened. The hunger disappeared. His body had entered survival mode and was beginning to consume itself. James would eventually lose nearly half of his body weight. To keep himself sane, he relied on the mental discipline he had learned through karate. He spent hours replaying techniques and movements in his mind, forcing himself to concentrate on tiny details rather than his suffering. Then one day he looked at his feet. They had turned blue. He couldn't feel them at all. Terrified of frostbite, he took a pair of medical scissors and stabbed himself in the foot. He felt absolutely nothing. He became convinced that even if he survived, he would lose both feet. One afternoon, he woke to the sound of horrifying animal screams nearby. He looked outside his shelter and saw a bush violently shaking. Then a large black figure emerged, a Himalayan black bear. The animal was staring directly at him. For a brief moment, James actually hoped the bear would attack. He was so weak and exhausted that death no longer frightened him. But instead, the bear became startled by his shouting and disappeared into the mountains. Still, for the next 5 nights, he heard it nearby. Every single night, he waited for it to return. Meanwhile, the rescue effort continued to fail. Search teams became lost, helicopters were forced back by terrible weather, and many people had already begun to assume that James was dead. Then something unexpected happened. James's sister, Joanne, visited a Buddhist lama. The spiritual leader studied a map and pointed to a small triangular region in the mountains. He insisted that James would be found there. Experts dismissed the prediction. But days later, rescuers finally located Mark Fulton, who explained where he and James had separated. To everyone's astonishment, the location matched the exact area identified by the lama. For the first time in weeks, there was hope. By now, James had been stranded for over a month. He was weak, skeletal, and suffering from infections. Then one day he heard something, a faint chopping noise, a helicopter. He rushed into the clearing and desperately waved his sleeping bag above his head. The helicopter circled in the distance before disappearing. It had never seen him. It was one of the most heartbreaking moments of his entire ordeal. A few days later, the sound returned. Again, James dragged himself outside. Again, he waved. This time, the helicopter circled directly above him. For nearly 20 minutes, he continued waving until he collapsed into the snow from exhaustion. Then it flew away, but this time he knew they had seen him. The following day, as he lay beneath his rocky shelter listening to the wind, he suddenly heard voices. At first, he assumed he was hallucinating. Then the voices came closer. He whistled. A whistle came back. Moments later, 2 rescuers crawled beneath the overhang. One of them looked at him and asked, "Are you James Scott from Australia?" Barely able to speak, James whispered, "Yes." The rescuers immediately embraced him. They had spent weeks searching for a man everyone thought was dead. One of them looked at James and simply said, "You are a god." Nobody had ever survived this long in that part of the Himalayas. Most people died within days. James Scott had endured 43. The next morning, a helicopter finally carried him out of the mountains. When it landed, his sister ran toward him and embraced him. She barely recognized him. He had lost an enormous amount of weight, his beard had grown thick, and his body was close to complete collapse, but he was alive. Against every possible odds, James Scott had survived one of the most terrifying survival ordeals ever recorded in the Himalayas, proving that the human will to live is capable of enduring far more than anyone could ever imagine.